Captain Elise Hartley walked into the military conference hall wearing a uniform that didn't match anyone else's, not the usual dress blues or freshly pressed camouflage, but an old olive green field jacket, faded at the seams, sleeves rolled slightly, and no flashy medals or ribbons on her chest. And as she passed the rows of officers, most of them men with polished boots and proud faces, the room grew still for a second before the snickering began. Quiet at first, then louder as Colonel Whitaker leaned back in his chair and chuckled. Looks like someone raided a museum closet, and the room joined in with smirks and stifled laughter. But Elise didn't slow down, didn't change her expression, didn't look around for approval. She walked straight to the front table with a small binder in her hand and eyes fixed forward. Because she hadn't come here to look impressive. She came to show them something that could save lives, even if they didn't think she belonged. And though she heard another voice, Lieutenant Morrison, say under his breath, "Maybe it's Halloween early this year," she stayed calm, took her place and waited for her turn to speak, knowing she didn't look like what they expected, because she wasn't here for a job or a medal. She had seen something during deployment that had changed her, something that broke her heart, and something that made her decide to come back home and do something about it. Because in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, a young soldier named Darren had bled out waiting for orders to get evac, and Elise had been just seconds too late to save him, not because she didn't know how to help, but because the radio orders hadn't cleared in time, and that moment stayed with her, haunting her at night, replaying in her mind every time she closed her eyes. So she wrote a new battlefield triage plan, a better, faster way to save wounded soldiers without waiting for command approval, a system that allowed medics to act immediately based on injuries and danger levels, a protocol that could have saved Darren's life and many others. And now, standing in this cold, proud room full of medals and dismissive stares, she knew she had one chance to make them listen, but as she opened her binder, Colonel Whitaker raised his hand and said, "Captain, before you start, can we ask why you're wearing something that hasn't been standard issue since the Cold War?" And Elise looked up, calm, and said, "Because it belonged to my mother, a field medic in Vietnam who saved more lives than anyone in this room." And though her voice didn't shake, her hands were tight at her sides, and the room shifted slightly, awkward now. But the colonel didn't stop there. He leaned forward and said, "Well, this isn't a memorial service, Captain. We're here to evaluate battlefield planning, not family history." And Elise nodded once, not angry, just tired, and began her presentation anyway, showing the charts, the data, the delay times, the case studies from her time in the field, and the pilot tests she'd run with a volunteer unit who trusted her plan. And for a while there was silence, not respect, but silence, until Lieutenant Morrison again leaned toward another officer and whispered, "Why didn't she just stick to nursing like her mother?" And that's when the door at the back of the hall opened sharply, and a figure stepped inside wearing desert tan fatigues, boots covered in dust, a long scar running from his left ear to his jaw, and no visible rank. But every soldier in that room knew him in an instant. Commander Jackson Rourke, SEAL Team 9's silent legend, the man who had once walked 5 wounded men through a minefield to rescue a downed pilot, the man who never gave interviews, who refused medals, who had been presumed dead twice but came back both times carrying someone else on his back. And without a word, he walked to the front of the room, standing beside Elise like it was where he belonged, and placed a worn flash drive on the table, saying only, "We field-tested this protocol in Kandahar, cut response time in half, and saved 7 lives in 1 week." And the silence in the room turned heavy, thick with disbelief and confusion, as Whitaker blinked and tried to speak. But Rourke raised his voice slightly, calm but firm. "I've seen a lot of plans written by people who've never been under fire. This isn't one of them." And then he turned toward Elise and saluted her, sharp and full, A salute not given lightly, not out of habit but out of respect, and the entire room went still, eyes wide. Because no one expected that. Not from Rourke. Not to someone they had just laughed at, and Elise, still calm but now blinking hard to hold back the tears building behind her eyes, returned the salute slowly, and for the first time that day, she felt seen, not as a woman in an old jacket, not as a name on a list, but as a soldier who had earned her place in blood, sweat and pain, and Rourke turned to the room and said, "If you don't adopt her protocol, I won't deploy with your strategy team again." And the weight of that statement hung like a verdict in the air, because losing Rourke's cooperation meant more than a dozen failed missions and broken alliances. And suddenly Colonel Whitaker was clearing his throat and trying to regain control, saying, "Of course, we'll give the protocol full review," but his voice cracked slightly. His face red, and Elise simply nodded, closed her binder, and said, "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I came here to stop good people from dying alone in the dirt," and turned to leave. But before she could reach the door, another officer stood up and said, "Captain, I'd like a copy of that protocol for my medical unit," and then another and another, until the room no longer felt cold or dismissive. It felt like something shifting, something opening, and as Elise walked down the hallway, her fingers brushed the edge of her mother's patch sewn into the inside of the jacket sleeve, a small cross and the word mercy, and she smiled for the first time that day, because she knew her mother would be proud, and maybe Darren too, and maybe, just maybe, the next time someone called in a medevac from a fire zone, they wouldn't have to wait 3 deadly minutes for permission to save a life because someone, somewhere, remembered the day the girl in the old jacket walked into a room of doubters and walked out with their respect.